This is Dave Moss, host of the Open Door Philanthropy podcast and founder of the Unfunded List. Thank you for joining me. This week I have Lynn O'Connell on a Google Meet, and I thought I would record it. Hello, Lynn. How are you?
I am great. It's good to be with you here today, Dave.
Very good. Where, in fact, are you? You are not actually in my bedroom with me.
No, I am in Alexandria, Virginia, sitting in my house, waiting for the snow to come yet again.
Yes, they say it's going to snow. I am up in D.C. for a little bit, and I have painters. So I have sequestered here in my bedroom with my microphones, and we're going to talk about philanthropy. And what I usually do is I just dive right into it. Is that all right with you?
Sure, go for it.
All right. What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up?
First question, and I already laugh. Usually my answer to that is a question. Where do you think I'm from? That being said, since this is a podcast, Dave,
I did research you beforehand. I think I know.
I may have told you too. At any rate, I'm from Kentucky, and I'm always very pleased that I think, anyway, that I no longer have a Kentucky accent. At any rate, I grew up in Kentucky. Actually, it was a very poor, impoverished area of Kentucky. In school, I fell in love with school at a very early age, and I knew pretty early on the goal of my life was to get out of Kentucky. By the time I got to junior high school, I ended up being the representative for Kentucky and Ohio to go to the National Spelling Bee, which was in Washington, D.C. And that was my first time out of Kentucky, staying at the Mayflower Hotel for this National Spelling Bee on television. Funny experience I've never forgotten. You know, here I am at age 12. I got stuck in the elevator for over an hour with Colonel Sanders and a man for the older listeners, John Ehrlichman. And again, very funny experiences. So
I don't think I'm old, but I do know John.
You do know John Ehrlichman, okay?
And Colonel Sanders.
Yeah, you know Colonel Sanders. Yeah,
my main question is, I'm assuming that you did not win the spelling bee.
Sadly, no. My word that I lost on was gloaming.
Yes.
Gloaming.
Gloaming.
Which means the way the light looks at sunset. It's not one many of us use.
It's like, I feel like that's something that comes up in like Irish poetry.
Exactly.
The heather in the fields is in the gloaming.
Exactly. So anyway, but the trip was...
Well, congratulations for winning. You beat everyone. You beat all the other kids from Kentucky. I bet.
That's true.
I bet they spell. That state is known for being a strong spelling state. Good spellers.
No, not really, but oh well. I think I can't remember who won that year. At any rate, so I came back to Kentucky after a week in D.C., and I decided that working in education would be what would finally get me out of Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
Then I got out, I went away to college, and after that, I went overseas, but you're going to come to those questions in a few minutes.
Yes, sure thing. But when you were a child in Kentucky, in the hollers and whatnot, what did you like to do?
Honestly, I did a lot of reading.
That's how you became good at spelling, I assume? Did you do any? Did you put the book down ever? Did you play in the hollers? Did you go outside a lot?
No, I'm still a couch potato to this day, sadly. Not much outside, walking to and from school. But no, I did a lot of theater, though. I did do a great deal of theater.
From an early age?
Yeah, I started out acting. I was doing local non-school theater by the time I was about 11. I think my first play I ever appeared in was George Washington Slept Here.
I see. I was in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Ah.
I was Charlie, of course. Actually before that I believe I was some sort of bee. I got dressed up like a bee in first grade.
Yeah, I think for
And
first
buzzed,
grade, I
and
was
made
the
a lot of
littlest
buzzing
Christmas
sounds.
tree. I was the littlest Christmas tree because I was really short. But it was a very good role, little Christmas tree there. So,
Yes, and now I'm remembering now that when you first came to us to evaluate, that you already knew Margaret
exactly.
through theater.
From
So
theater.
that's something that you've stayed involved with. Margaret and I, who run the Unfunded List, both have theater backgrounds, and that's actually been very helpful. Theater is very interesting to me in that, you can work with even an amateur, not just professionals, anyone who's a theater practitioner from anywhere in the world. And generally, we all know what the process is. We understand how rehearsal works, and we have a shared vocabulary and shared experience. It's not necessarily true of all professions. Like, sometimes they work differently and all that. And in fact, like, you wouldn't necessarily be able to jump into any fundraising office and instantly know the process.
True. But yes, theater is a great equalizer.
So Margaret and I talk about notes, right, and rehearsals, right, and those sorts of things often. And it's been helpful to have that shared experience. So staying with little Lynn in Kentucky, not so much frolicking in the fields, but perhaps heading down to the community theater, enjoying school, these sorts of things. One of the questions we like to ask everyone who comes onto the podcast is, do they remember the first time that they were generous or that they gave a gift?
I do. And
Great.
It's funny. It was a complete disaster. Now I
You
say,
failed?
many decades later. I mean, it was fine at the time. I didn't realize it was a disaster. So even though I was very poor and all of our classmates were poor, in my second grade class, there was a little boy. His initials were DL, and he was poorer than all of us. Like, he didn't ever get to eat lunch. So I decided one Christmas that I was going to give him a box with a whole bunch of Christmas gifts in it. And I had the blessing of my parents, and I had the blessing of my teacher and the school's principal. So so I did this phenomenal box filled with all these wrapped gifts, and anonymously I had the teacher put it by his desk just before we were to go home for Christmas break. And he did take it home, and I have no idea what happened after that, but I thought afterwards, what a way to sort of show someone out as being poor and needy. So I really regret that now, years later. But it was a first. At least
Well, you did do it.
Did something.
Well, one, you were I think it would have been the adults that you ran this plan by, on them to figure that out. And it could have been done in a way that didn't call you. You did it anonymously, and right.
And he didn't seem upset by it, but in retrospect, as I look back, I cringe a bit now. So it may have been fine. I'll never know. Sadly, and this has always been interesting to me, after we all graduated from high school, he was the first individual in my class who died. He went off, he joined the Army, and he was killed just about a year and a half after we graduated. So that's always stuck with me too, sort of the haves and have-nots, if you will, perhaps.
Yes. Now, I would say, as someone who sometimes criticizes philanthropy, that was ineffective. You weren't addressing the root causes, right? I don't know everything about his background, but there's many institutional and systemic reasons that cause poverty in all throughout Appalachia. And in fact, some of those, we don't need to talk about how many decades ago that was, but many of those issues still, we knew about them then. We're not necessarily addressing them even still. Addressing the systemic inequality that caused little DL to be poor would have been very difficult. But it is a nice feel-good story for all the adults, right? And I can see this being the sort of thing that they would put on Good Morning America, that a little girl got a bunch of gifts, right, for the poor kid, right? And in fact, it is somewhat of a tragedy. That you even, like, you had it's very, I like that one. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. You had the empathy to recognize it. And it's not something that he should have to feel bad about. Not his fault. Little deal. I'm sure he hadn't made poor financial decisions. Right?
Yeah, and
Lost the
I'm
family
not sure
farm.
how he felt about it at the time, but decades later, I still cringe a bit. But
Yes. So as far as I can tell, like I said, I do some research on my guests, and we've known you a little while reviewing. As far as I can tell, you are a Christian. Were you? You went to church there in Kentucky growing up?
well, first I say, good, I'm doing something right. You could read about me and discover I was a Christian, so that's good. I did. I went to church all through my childhood in a local church and have continued my entire life. I've always tended toward non-denominational, fairly conservative churches. That's just has been my preference. Two of my big beliefs, and I think a lot of things about religion. Dave, we could have done a whole podcast on faith.
Yes.
At any rate, my two things I think about religion are, first of all, that we all need to be out there interacting with the world. You know, church is not in a building. It's being out with people. It's interacting with everyone who's there. And secondly, I think it's a key part of being a Christian is helping those in need. Physical needs, poverty, all of those things. And I think a lot of us who are Christians, you know, we could do more of this. I have been attending a church called National Community Church out of DC, and we have an emergency needs fund. We have a resource database where people could put in, I need a coat for my 10-year-old. I need a car to get to work. And then other people put what they have to give away. This weekend, we're launching the Dream Collective, which is going to give funds to people who are launching their own businesses or nonprofits. So I believe philanthropy is a very key part of faith, and faith can be a key part of philanthropy.
Well, for the vast majority of the history of philanthropy, it's exclusively been the providence of faith. It's been churches and temples and organized religion that have conducted it, and they continue to conduct it to this day. And most of your major, even your like secular philanthropists, like Rockefeller, for instance, hired a nun to run his foundation. And a lot of the language is the same. And certainly you're right. That's a fundamental part. A point I do like to make is that they do continue to, a lot of entrepreneurs who aren't running a like religious institution and who may not be particularly religious themselves, or at least not attending services very regularly, that, as you may know, but church and temple attendance have been going down.
Exactly. And
a lot of social entrepreneurs tend to ignore this sort of thing. I ask a lot of them, like, what's the role of faith with this, right? They'll be talking about things like the future of work, for instance. A lot of the proposals we read on the future of work, I will ask them, I'm like, well, what do you know about, the Protestant Reformation? And they're like, I don't, nothing. Or I'm like, how could you possibly be working on the future of work if you don't know anything about the Protestant Reformation? And they're confused that I asking that question, which isn't a great sign. Others know a lot about it and will talk to me. That's when I get a little bit more excited about the more holistic solutions. But we are, I think, fundamentally, we're a generation that sort of lost trust in a lot of the religious institutions. And those of us who want to solve problems aren't looking there as much as it might have in the past. And that happened at the same time that a lot of organized philanthropists started giving, and not necessarily through a religious lens. However, we do know from the data that most giving, a very large amount of giving, goes to faith-based organizations or directly to churches. The last time it's been a little while since I looked at the numbers, but a very large amount. And you have, in fact, a fund at your church, you mentioned?
We have several funds, yeah.
Tell me a little bit more. Yeah, tell me a little. There's some sort of emergency, so something for COVID response?
Emergency, and it wouldn't have to be COVID. In today's world, it is COVID almost always. People.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what were you doing before the pandemic?
There was emergency needs for people still lost their jobs before COVID, or people still had
I lost many.
Or a spouse.
I have kind of a big mouth. So for and then there's support for entrepreneurs
that we're just launching, so I haven't seen the full display. It'll come out tomorrow, actually.
So local
but it's
area
for entrepreneurs of businesses as well as nonprofits.
And they have to be from Alexandria?
No, anywhere in the country, primarily, though, the Metro DC area.
Okay, there's a lot of folks starting businesses and nonprofits in the area. And they should keep looking on that. Anyway,
absolutely.
That's very cool. So you were sort of talking about two things when it comes to what, why church is important to you. The first one I think I would call fellowship, right? You got to go out there and you have to see. It's not just that's my building, right? Or I follow these rules.
Yeah,
right?
It's about being out in the community and being a part of the community. And the second is supporting those people in need.
Terrific. The main thing that gave it away, you were a Christian, is I noticed you went to somewhere called David Lipscomb.
Okay, yes. David Lipscomb University in Nashville is
I had not heard of it, and I looked it up, and it was formerly Nashville Bible College.
It was, but that was way back in the 1800s.
Sure. I think, in fact, so I went to Dickinson College, and I do believe its first name was like Carlisle Bible College or something like that.
I did not know that, Dave. Interesting.
And in fact, Colby College, where I grew up, was originally like Colby Theological Institute. Or Waterville Theological Institute, which is not a good name. Colby College is good, strong. But just like with philanthropy, for a very long time in human history, the church ran everything, including education. Right? It's not that surprising, but it did seem like it was particularly Christian college that only a Christian would choose to go to.
Yeah, pretty much, except for some of our sports players who were recruited in because they were good at sports. Overall, it was a very religious school. We had to go to chapel every day.
Every day?
Monday through Friday.
All right. That's a lot of chapel.
Okay.
Hey, but you signed up for this. You could have gone. Many schools do not make you do that.
I am very glad I went there. It was a great place to first sort of try my wings outside of Kentucky, and I met great people that I'm still friends with. It gave me a lot of perspectives on religion, what to believe, what to not to believe. Just a very good exposure. A great way to start my adult life.
Mm-hmm. And you went on to receive a formal education in philanthropy.
I did.
For a long time, there was one program in the country where you could get a degree in philanthropy, and you went. And am I correct that when you went there, this was the only for someone who wanted?
I was in their second cohort of classes, and they were just beginning, and that was Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. Ooey pooey by those of us who go there or went there.
Ooey pooey. So before the show, you told me that that's what people called it, and I figured that you were trying to trick me.
No, I was not.
But you said you said it first. Ooey pooey, Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis.
Which definitely has to be shortened because it takes forever to say that. So ooey pooey works.
And where is it in Indianapolis?
It is in Indianapolis, and it's really the campuses combined of Indiana University and Purdue University. We have one combined campus there.
So what kind of classes do you take when you're getting a degree in philanthropy?
So and we already mentioned this sort of, there's the history of philanthropy. So we started back at 10,000 BC and came all the way up through the centuries. And then we also touched on all the cultural differences of philanthropy. You know, what it's like in East Polynesia, what it's like in East Asia, what it's like amongst different religions, what it's like in the Middle East, and coming up through history. So that was fascinating. A lot about ethics, of course, and a lot of reading of some of the early great masters. One of my favorite books from that was actually a book called The Arrogant Beggar, which was written in 1927, which is just as relevant today and talks about really what philanthropists should and shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. There were legal courses, legal lawsuits involving nonprofits and what the outcomes were. A lot of background in finance and how to do accounting for nonprofits. The best part, like any master's program, I would argue, was really the connections and the networking. Being in that second cohort at Ooey Pooey, we had the mayor of Portland, Maine in my class. There was someone who ran a foundation in Turkey in my class. And so you had a very diverse group of students.
Yeah, very cool. And then, over the years, largely due to Doris Buffett, who gave the grants possible to many schools. The last I heard is nearly 100 places you could get a degree in philanthropy. But when you were there, right, you said not only was it the only one, but this was the second time, right? So you're one of the very first people ever in a formal education of philanthropy. Exactly. And that does kind of highlight one of our working theories here, and something that we do talk to our proposal authors a lot about, is that philanthropy is a very new field. And when I say philanthropy, right, you were mentioning 10,000 BC. When I say philanthropy, and when we're educating people, the mission of Unfunded List is to educate the public about philanthropy. And what we're educating people about is not very similar to what they were doing in 10,000. I think you're probably sort of looking at anthropology there, and how, right, a big part of humanity is that we did work together, right, and in order to thrive, right. And we have some resources available on the history of philanthropy on our website for folks that really want to take a deep dive. If they want to avoid reading some of the textbooks about history of philanthropy, which is largely just the history of administrative law and administrative tax law, right? So the major events are like, because, rich people in America made more money for themselves than really anybody ever had. There was like a large number of people who had obscene amounts of money, more money than they could possibly spend. And many of them wrote about this. There's a great essay by Carnegie. I think it's just called On Wealth. And there's a line in it, I forget, I used to be able to quote it, but I can't recall it exactly. But it's really kind of, he's like, no one on earth, like, it is really crazy how much I have, right? It's basically the gist of what he's saying. Right. And he went about the organized task of giving it all away, and very quickly learned that it's work. He had to hire professionals full-time who did it. And there's a lot of very interesting, if you do want to read a history of philanthropy textbook, there's one by Oliver Zunes. I think it's just called History of Philanthropy. Okay, right. And in particular, it's got some good quotes in the beginning from folks that were just sort of, they want to give their money away, but they're bothered by the people who are asking. It's like and in general, there's just too many of them. We tell a story often on the podcast and elsewhere about Olivia Slocum Sage, and there is still the Russell Sage Foundation in existence, and it's very organized and specific in its funding. But originally, the widow Sage, after her husband died, was not that specific. She just published a letter in the New York Times. I'm a very rich widow, and I have more money than I need. Please just send me a letter, tell me what you want, and I'll give you the money. More or less, that's what she wrote. No one had ever done anything like that before. She had no idea that it would be way too many people, right? It's kind of similar. It's a similar naivete to you in class with DL, right? I think one of the things that you didn't understand then is that, like, there were probably other kids in your class who were needy. He was probably not. He might have been the most obvious, but you weren't looking at their tax. You didn't do the means testing, right? You don't know that he was the poorest. Right? You didn't make everyone in your class write a grant proposal, so you could probably assess, like, the impact of your...
And we couldn't write yet, Dave. I remember it was second grade.
I was writing pretty well.
I don't think we could do grant proposals in second grade.
Yeah. Well, why not? This is why Kentucky is falling behind. I'm at the age where a lot of my friends have children, and they try to give me updates about them, and my question is always the same: is just let me know when they can review grant proposals.
Of course.
I look forward to assigning grant. What are their interests? What issue areas and topics would your child like to read? And eventually, one of them will be like, "Yeah, I think he might be old enough," or she, probably she. Most of our evaluators are women, about 70%. But who knows for the future generation? Perhaps the men of the future will be more willing to volunteer, like you do, to read grant proposals with us. And thanks again for that. So what are your thoughts on the expansion of the study of philanthropy? Right, since the Sages, we've seen a lot of expansion in the, like, professionals who do it. She did not read all the letters that she received. She set up a foundation, and because she got too many, it would not have been possible. She died before anyone would have possibly been able to read them. But she set up a foundation, and they got to work, and that's what Rockefeller and Carnegie and all them, and continuously what they'll do is hire philanthropy advisors, which is one of the fastest growing fields for new businesses in the country, right? And also, but in education, right, expanding quick as well. What are your thoughts on, right? It's an interesting experience having gone to the only one of these programs, and now there's many.
I think maybe the field has become too full. I, as someone who teaches in a lot of programs, I guess I can get away with saying this. I think that somehow the education sector has become more of a business itself. So how do we get more people enrolled in things? I think for those people interested in philanthropy and nonprofits, the two best things to be, one could be just jump in and do it. And the other is, it almost goes back to the faith question too. Get out there, engage with people, talk with people. For me, I found the class experience phenomenal because I was early enough that I had some really great members in my cohort. And secondly, I knew I wanted to teach, and I needed that advanced degree to teach. But I think for the average person, particularly at the cost of higher education today and the loans and the debts at this point, I recommend just getting out there and doing it, but maybe taking some classes or finding a mentor along the way.
And in fact, if you want to get experience in reading grant proposals, you could volunteer.
Come to the Unfunded List.
And I will give you all the grant proposals you want. We have our own trainings and everything.
And I do say in the many grant writing classes I teach, I do always say the best way to learn to write grants is to be a reviewer.
Yes. And actually, in fact, sometimes they listen to you, and then they come and they sign up to be an evaluator, and they write, and we ask them, like, how did you find out about us? And they say, Lynn O'Connell.
Wonderful. Hopefully they were good reviewers and got the reviews in on time.
For the most part. It is it's difficult to manage. We have hundreds of volunteers here, and anyone who's got a program like this and that involves volunteer reviewers, it is difficult, right? And I certainly don't have the money to pay a bunch of people to review all these proposals. And I think that would fundamentally change, right, the feedback that we have.
Absolutely.
One of the things that is important to me, and I want to ask your opinion about it in a second here. So we aren't. This is right. It's not. I am a nonprofit. Unfunded List is a not-for-profit. It's not a company. We're not development consultants. My goal is not to raise as much money as I can for every proposal that comes here. If you're sending a proposal because you want me to raise more money for you, that's not exactly the right reason you should say. That often happens, right? We are going to give you feedback on your proposal. If your proposal might be bad, it might be unfundable. You might need to focus on a different kind of revenue, or you might have a kind of flawed. You might be doing a flawed approach, something that funders are kind of hip to and no longer funding, right? There's all kinds of things that can happen through the feedback process. Everybody running a nonprofit, running grant proposals, needs to have it read by an unbiased committee to get or else they won't really know the full impact of their work. When we work with academic programs, which we do sometimes, right? There's all kinds of different schools. Some of them have been very clear to me that the goal of working with us is that they want their alumni to start nonprofits that raise large amounts of money. They've been very clear that the metric is more dollars raised. And I'm like, well, if they're starting nonprofits, right? That's a weird thing to be your only, it's nonprofits right there in the name of what it is, right? We can talk, I could help you have your alumni start the nonprofits that are going to have the most impact, be the most likely to be successful. And many programs, that's what they want to do, right? You've read some proposals from MIT through their Solve program, right? They want to solve these issues, right? They also need to fund that program. And so sometimes they have, right, they fund in areas that are in overlap with their donors' interests. And if a new donor were to come in with new interests, they might start a new challenge. And in fact, they designed themselves to be that way. There's more than enough challenges, right? Same thing with here. Unfunded List doesn't have a specific type of thing. Whatever proposal you've written, we know that you need feedback, right? Some of these programs, new philanthropy programs undoubtedly were set up because they want nonprofits with greater impact, and others because they want their alumni to raise a lot more money. Right? Is that a problem? Is that a deal?
I think it's probably true. I would agree with you that the mission and the board's push should not be for the most money. It should be for the greatest impact on society. And that does not always exactly equate to the more money, the more impact. Not necessarily.
Yeah,
It may not be addressing systemic change, perhaps, if you do want it to. Or it may be that it's the sort of project, maybe you're working with severely disabled adults and you're doing 24/7 care. That's going to cost a lot. Some people might argue that it has more limited impact because it's not feeding 5 million.
Yes. And there's many different schools of thought on that. Right? There was the famous, still operating Open Philanthropy Project. I interviewed one of their program officers with the same microphone one time. And it's very much an algorithmic approach. They want each dollar to save the most lives, right? But that algorithm is probably never going to end up funding art or the opera, right? And there are a lot of qualitative folks. For the vast majority of time that religious institutions were doing funding, they were doing it in line with their values and not in any kind of connection to capitalism. A working theory we have here on Unfunded List is that philanthropy is fundamentally separate from capitalism, right? That in order to be engaged in philanthropy, you're giving excess money away, and you get to do things that are free of the wheel of capitalism. If you run a for-profit business, you have a bottom line, and you have to, right? You have to obey it. And you have investors. Your obligation to them exceeds your obligation to have impact on the world. And I have seen it many, many, many times that so-called social businesses, right? They'll promise that a certain percentage is going here, or that we're doing this or whatever, right up until the investors need their check. Yeah. That's the first thing that will get cut afterwards. They have to. It's always very clear in the fine print that that's how it's working, mm-hmm. Right? And anyone in an MBA program will learn that, right? You'll sell more of the product if you can have some sort of social mission attached to it. So then they're all really it's very difficult to, right? When someone started a nonprofit, right, and filed their tax statement differently, you can sort of like, well, okay, they're probably not in it for the money because because of the formation, right? And that's the general idea. And it allows them to do things that capitalism would not and has not funded, right? What are your thoughts on things that should be funded with excess money? And what are things that should be funded with tax dollars, or that religious institutions should be funding? Do you have thoughts on that kind of segmentation?
I think that in today's world, we need to rely on community-based organizations, whatever they may be. And that could be nonprofits. That could be local government agency. That could be faith-based community, or that could be some sort of for-profit business or social organization community there. Really, it's so much of what we have as far as the systems today came about from the IRS originally and tax code and things. And at the end of the day, to really help communities, I think it's got to be the networks of people and figuring it out. I don't know if that answers exactly the question you're asking, but
so we'll talk. So another new field in academia, similar to philanthropy, is actually the field of computer science. 100 years ago, there was no computer science departments in the country, and today, I'm pretty sure even David Lipscomb University has a computer science department.
They had it when I went there, Dave.
But at one point there were none of them. That's my point. And now pretty much every school has a computer science department. In many schools, that's the main department that they have. Right? The primary funder for computer science departments to create them was IBM. The IBM, in fact, this is why IBM set up the IBM Foundation, was to give large grants to educational institutions and to stay within the tax code of what is technically philanthropy. And this is genius of them, really. And they got to do it in a way that trained their workforce. Because it was just a perfect fit to all the schools, right? It was like, I will give you the money you need to build this department, buy these fancy computers, right? Which will attract the best and brightest students interested in learning about them, right? And then I'm going to hire your graduates too, right? And what they end up getting, they got much more affordable job training program for themselves. And
absolutely, and we see that today. Microsoft, for example, or Avid, all of the businesses that use those typically do invest in or give charitably to nonprofit programs that teach those things, whether it's schools or other nonprofits.
Well, I think there's you've got what I think is a great example of the difference between funding within the wheel of capitalism and funding outside of it, right? Is like when you're IBM and you're doing that, like yes, you have technically followed the rules of philanthropy, right? But you are inside it's your goals are the same. You need tech workers in order to run your company, right? And any time a tech company is funding a computer science department, right, or a tech accelerator program or a prize for solutions or whatever, it is in some way connected to their bottom line, and that means that the decisions they make, right, are capitalistic decisions. They're not values-based decisions. This isn't. I'm probably sound critical, right? This is just a way of. It is just. It's. I'm fairly neutral about this type of funding. It's the vast majority of funding that happens. It flows through capitalistic institutions who want to continue to exist, and in order to do that, they have to bring in more money than they spend each year, right? Which is also true for Unfunded List. We have to bring in more money than we spend each year, right? But we do not have, and in fact cannot reward our investors. So I have to convince people to just donate money to us. So that, because there really is not any capitalistic version of Unfunded List, right? I would start being like, well, I need to raise more money for these, right? And I'm a very good fundraiser. I can raise money for programs that are less than perfect. But anyone who's been doing philanthropy for a while will know that the best programs don't necessarily get the grants.
Of course not. It's who you know, and it's timing and who you ask. Right.
And it's a difficult process to identify the best grantees. And I don't think, because it's a new field that we haven't really been doing it long. We don't really.
Definition of best. Best is going to differ between each funding source, what they would consider the best grantee.
So I think a lot of people who are fundraising get frustrated at some point by organized philanthropy. And it's very interesting. I myself, frustrated by it. And they just sort of, or confused, right? I think one thing for them to keep in mind is that we don't necessarily know the best way to give grants. It's still a very new field. And we are mostly doing our best. Would you agree?
Yeah, I still agree that though diverse grant making is okay. It's a match, just like dating would be. Someone might marry this person, someone else would have nothing to do with them and marry this person. It's the same with funding sources. It's matching funding sources to the programs and to the entities that need the grants.
Yes. But I think one of the problems with all of those computer science departments, for instance, being created by people who want to hire the folks that learned it, right, mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that thought leaders created the curriculum to best serve all of humanity.
Absolutely not. And maybe there is and I have not studied it in a while. Actually, when I was at Computer Corps, I did look at it more closely, but which tech companies are funding which programs where, and there may be some that are a bit of monopoly, but then still you've got some diversity there. And the other thing that's a blessing is hopefully it's getting the folks out of college into jobs, into career paths.
Yeah, good jobs are great, but you also want tech companies to be making ethical decisions. And you've had some notable examples of famous college dropouts making unethical decisions. And I think it's worth noting that they dropped out of Harvard before they took their ethics requirements. I've named them before. I think most people probably know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
and there's more than one.
Aware,
I'm not even. This isn't. This,
yeah, I am aware. I'm thinking the most recent one at the moment, but yeah.
And these men continue to be involved, have an outsized role in philanthropy, right? And some of that is still connected to the bottom line of the companies that they work with, right? They're still somewhat trapped in the wheel, and I'd love to see them freed from the wheel of capitalism. I really would, Lynn. It's fun out here. You get to do a lot. I find that you get to do a lot more interesting stuff, and you get to be a lot more genuinely helpful to people without expecting them to give immense back to you. The unfunded proposal writers who come to us for help are not really in a position to help us much.
Yeah. One thing too, if I had to place blame, I might look at the schools who are taking the money a bit more closely too. It's
some of them are taking grants they didn't necessarily need, right? And I think sometimes donors are making requests that they really that aren't appropriate. And the fact that these large, well-known institutions are acquiescing to those requests is now setting a standard that they are appropriate, right? I mean, if Harvard does it,
true.
So a great program that does it, that I believe someone probably fundraised for, is the Fulbright program. You were a Fulbright scholar, not the first on the program, and hopefully not the last. We've had some program officers who worked there evaluate with us. They were very good evaluators. And I believe my mom read proposals for it or something. It's named after U.S. Senator.
Correct.
From Arkansas.
William Fulbright, Arkansas.
My boss, one of my old bosses in D.C., Marcia Scott, was a intern in Fulbright's office and was there when it got created or whatever. What was it? What does that mean anyway? You were a Fulbright scholar. What does that mean? What did you do?
So as a Fulbright scholar, my project, I went over to France in Normandy, a very small town called Elbeuf.
Sorry, what was it called?
Elbeuf.
Elbeuf.
Like beef, like the cow.
Oh.
Elbeuf. My French accent is horrible. It never was very good. It's gotten worse.
Le Boeuf or?
No, Elbeuf.
Elbeuf. So it's kind of a Spanish French town.
Yes, near Rouen. At any rate, so I was actually teaching and working on projects about American business and American computers.
Okay.
And
IBM.
So it was fascinating.
Most of what you need to know.
Yeah, it was a very small town, and actually it ended up being bombed by the Americans during World War II. So there was not a positive American influence there, really. So it was fascinating to talk to people and to learn the different attitudes they had. It was also a very depressed community. Huge number of immigrants from North Africa were there.
Yes, I think I've heard that. As you know, my Jane Moss is a French professor, and in particular focus on the diaspora, other Francophone people who don't live in France. Very cool. And it was difficult to become a Fulbright scholar. Did you apply?
It was sort of funny. Going to David Lipscomb University, it was all sort of serendipitous, I think. So I went to David Lipscomb University, and of course, I had to work. I worked full-time my entire time.
It's basically a Fulbright feeder program, right? David Lipscomb.
No, not at all. Not at all, of course. So I worked full-time, and one of my several jobs was I was the secretary for the department, the language department chairman, and she was the French teacher, Dr. Sarah Witten. And so I was her secretary, and I did other jobs too. And she was getting ready to retire, and she'd never had a Fulbright scholar before in all her 40-some years of teaching. And so she said, Lynn, please apply. And so I applied, and miracle of miracles, I got selected. I think it was on the interview. I don't think it could have been on Extreme Intelligence, but I hope I charmed them during the interview or something. At any rate, I was selected.
And
then, I was my first experience overseas. DC was my first experience domestically, and then France was my first experience out of the country as a Fulbright.
Very cool. Thank you, Senator Fulbright.
Exactly.
I assume he's passed.
Quite a while ago, but the program is still going strong. Thank heaven.
Yes.
Knock on wood.
And is this a State Department program?
It is.
So you're a State Department alum?
Yeah, and there's many different aspects to it if you actually study it. I'm actually in the Fulbright Specialist program now, but I don't have much time. The Fulbright Specialist program, you can actually go overseas and do short projects for like 3 to 4
There's a lot of
months.
really, I meet a lot of State Department alumni. I used to work at Atlas Corps, and all the fellows from there are State Department alumni. A lot of our evaluators have been through Peace Corps or whatever, right? Anybody who does any of these things is if you go to any sort of exchange program, you're an alumni from the State Department. They have a lot of really cool resources available, particularly on fundraising. Did you know that you can get free foundation directory access as a State Department alumni?
I did not know that.
Yeah, I usually tell most of you would be if you did, you would have been the first State Department alumni who I asked that who did know.
Yeah, I did not know at all.
Yeah, there's all kinds of really interesting. You can basically get a free account and all the like cool resources there because those companies obviously want, right? State Department alumni means you're vetted.
Exactly.
These are very difficult programs to get through. All those ones I named take only a very small percentage. So anyway, go check that out. Right.
Okay, I learned something new. Thank you, Dave.
And then when you're evaluating proposals with us, you can go and you can look stuff up for them since you'll have the access.
I already have access to it through something else, but I'm glad I
know. You got to keep up with your research on those things because philanthropists are changing their programs constantly, right?
Yes.
And the deadlines, and there's many organized givers, right? Very cool. So you are a teacher. You mentioned that you love school. And you got a master's degree in philanthropy so that you could become a teacher of it.
Right.
And you've taught as an adjunct with Catholic University, different kind of Christians.
Yes.
And George Washington University, who was, I think, what was George Washington? He was like Church of England or something. Probably.
Who?
I'm just George Washington himself.
George Washington was Church of England, Anglican.
Yeah, yeah.
Today, what we might call Episcopalian, but.
And I think people of all faiths go to George Washington University. Probably and many faiths I've not even heard of. Probably it's a lot of students just down the street. We've done some events there. Yeah, you've come to our events there.
I did.
And you've launched 3 certificate in nonprofit management and leadership programs. As I mentioned, these programs are becoming more and more popular, and you've launched 3 of them. Tell me about that. What do you teach in these programs? What kind of students do you get? Are they all just trying to raise more money, or do they want to run impactful programs? Are they trying to free themselves from the wheel?
It varies greatly. I mean, originally I started teaching, about 25, 30 years ago, and I would have people take grant writing and or how to start a nonprofit and nothing else. And I was like, you need a lot more. You can't write a grant unless you know about strategic planning, unless you know about budgeting, unless you know about project development. Many more things to know. So I thought that if I would start certificate programs, then I could get the students to get a more rounded knowledge and also develop cohorts so they would know other people, so that they could recruit each other for jobs, recruit each other for their boards, and have people to share successes, challenges, grant opportunities with. So that was sort of my concept in starting them. The first one I started was in Colorado, and it's still very large, and I go out quarterly in non-COVID times. Currently, I'm teaching online there.
This was through through a school? Sorry,
Colorado Free University.
Does it cost money to go there?
No, you still have to pay. And then in the D.C. area in Northern Virginia Community College, and then through Fairfax County. So the students who come, it could be anybody. It could be somebody who wants to start a nonprofit, somebody who started one, someone who's following a founder. I get a lot of people who are looking for that transition, what the next thing is, leaving the military or something else. I get individuals who just somehow ended up on a board of directors and they wonder what they're supposed to be doing. So full range, which is what I love about it. And it's been exciting over the years to see, I try to keep up with most of them, to see, their organizations go national, or they finally got that major grant from Kellogg or whatever. So that's been quite good to see.
Yes, sometimes that happens here. Sometimes the people we review, they get grants. And sometimes they tell me about it. Usually I just read, I see them on a list. And I say, oh, I read their last failed grant proposal. It looks like they're winning them now, and they don't need Dave anymore. Do you find I started my career as a teacher, and that was one of the things that I did find difficult. I think every teacher has to deal with. They don't necessarily learn the lesson like right there in front of your eyes. From my own personal experience, I know sometimes it was like 10 years after I was like, oh yeah, Mr. McCarthy was right about that. Right? And I didn't necessarily call him to thank him or anything. Right? So he doesn't get to see the rewards.
I see it as being a toolkit. You know, I get a bunch of students. I will have, sometimes I Google them if I have time in advance, but I may not know their backgrounds. You could have some who had no idea what a nonprofit is. Others, sometimes I get EDs, executive directors who've been in their role for 30 years. So it's a wide spectrum. So I approach it, give tools and toolkits, and be like an improv performer, be ready to switch to address the needs that you find of the group. Sort of like acting.
I did an interview with Netta Zodi last season, which was I interviewed only women, season she. And what the main thing we talked about there is that we both consider ourselves nonprofit professionals, right? And it's a weird thing to be. Not everybody necessarily like understands it as a profession, right? It's not like it's like I'm a doctor, right? Or I'm a soldier, right? Everybody understands it, like, yes, that's a real job. I'm a policeman, right? It's a real job, and I have a general understanding of what that is, right? Nonprofit professional, I think. I mean, in DC, people know what that means, but because it's all of us, right? But it's am I correct? That's a career path. It's a skill set, and people must know certain things. I could go into many different roles at a nonprofit, not necessarily just the fundraising ones, because I'm a nonprofit professional. Just like a mechanic who could go to an auto shop and say, I can probably work there because I know how to do these things that show up in an auto. I can do oil changes and stuff like that. I know how to do. I can write a newsletter. I can learn what the organization is doing and write a newsletter for them, right? And I know how the appropriate tech works to send it out and all those things because I have those skills. So these are practical programs you're setting up.
Exactly. I base it really a lot on what do the people need to know right now, and what can start their stepping stones, and what resources can I introduce them to so they'll know what to do next. And, loved or not, one of the things I stress is maybe you should think several minutes before you start a nonprofit. In 2018, more people started nonprofits in America than small businesses. Now, I don't have the current statistics, but, again, look around. Don't necessarily think you have to recreate.
We have one of our most read articles on the website is the 5 tips for writing grant proposals. And our first tip is consider not doing it. Right. And it's often after I read someone's proposal through our program, I'm generally saying to them, this is not it's not that they have a bad idea. And in fact, they never do. No one ever comes to us with a fundamentally bad idea. They're fundamentally not grant ready some of the times, right? This isn't something a foundation would give a grant to. And here's the very specific reasons why. Right. Yeah. But it's not, they've all found real problems, right? And they've all come up with some kind of thing that would at least start to address the problem, right? It's obviously better, worse, right? A lot of this is opinion based, but no one's ever come to us with a fundamentally bad grant proposal that didn't even target a real problem or anything, right? People don't write them idly, I guess is my point.
Yeah. A lot of times you do better working with individual donors. And
yes, and in fact, that is the best. A lot of the reality here is that's the best. Grants from foundations is not the majority of funding. Not even close.
And also, it can be very expensive. It takes forever to get, and then the requirements to maintain the grant can be quite strenuous sometimes.
So I was asking about being a State Department alum. I briefly forgot you worked at the State Department.
I was a Foreign Service officer, a U.S. diplomat. And very humorous too. I'll go back to serendipity. After I came back from the Fulbright, I was living back in Nashville, Tennessee, and I decided that I wanted to pursue a more international lifestyle. So I started looking at jobs in DC, and I somehow ended up taking the Foreign Service exam, and I got in. I got in the days when less than 2% of the diplomats were women. And I moved to Washington, and I was an economic officer with a specialty of petroleum. I spoke French much better in those days, and I was trained in petroleum, of course. So I went to West Africa.
How do you say petroleum in French?
I don't even remember now. And besides,
this is just like petroleum. Yeah. You just say it with an attitude.
But I went to Liberia. I went to Liberia, which is English.
Liberia.
My first posting, and
in Monrovia.
In Monrovia.
Wow, what was that like?
And an internal civil war broke out, and so
that'll happen there.
Much of my State Department career was doing reporting on internal military battles, coups, interventions.
I placed an Atlas Corps fellow who was from Monrovia, and her great grandparents, I guess, had been freed American slaves.
Yeah.
Who took up the opportunity to go there when it was. First, that's my understanding of the history of Liberia. Is it was originally, it's called Liberia means free, and it was where I think there was probably some philanthropic funding involved to return slaves.
It was actually the president. Monrovia was named after President James Monroe, and the plan was to send the freed slaves over to West Africa, specifically to Liberia and Monrovia. I was not aware that it actually worked. It ultimately didn't, for many, many reasons, as all of us listening can figure out why. Maybe they did get one or two ships over there, but overall it was a quickly abandoned plan.
It also got into the plan never really, I'm remembering now, but it got into it became a romantic notion amongst freed slaves who didn't necessarily know that again, very few of them were actually from Liberia or had been
and most of them did not want to leave their homes and their families where they were. So it was not a popular plan. And then when they looked at it, they also realized that what would the freed slaves do over there? You needed to have programming in place.
One of the first of many poorly planned American-led interventions in that continent.
Exactly.
We're honestly continuing to do. Something we've talked about on the podcast a lot is the play pumps. Have you ever heard of? Do you remember play pumps? It was Nancy Reagan and some prominent philanthropists, and they set up merry-go-rounds in some African villages, and the merry-go-rounds also pumped water, right? But because they pumped water, they were a little bit more difficult to turn than most merry-go-rounds. Also, no one knew what a merry-go-round was there. Right. So the way I got explained to them was it's for the kids. Right. And so they thought they basically set up child labor programs. Right. With and there's images of young children being overworked, pushing these merry-go-rounds around so the village could have water. And again, this was a Nancy Reagan led thing, and it was generally a disaster.
My last trip, I try to go to Africa as much as I can. I'm a huge fan of sub-Saharan Africa. And I think my last trip was just before COVID in 2019. And I was over around Tanzania. And they had just had a program, which had not been done by Americans, but some nonprofits, they may have been American-based, had donated all these camels to the Tanzanian farmers in the Masai Mara. And the camels really couldn't survive in that climate. They were not indigenous to there. And second, it just made the Maasai and the other Tanzanian farmers all have to figure out how do they feed all these new mouths of the camels, or do they let them die? So it was a really big problem. And then the camels started having camel babies.
Yes, that's the other one.
It was very sad.
There was also, I heard a story once that it was a barber training program or something. They were going to give everyone barber skills, but literally everyone in that community shaves their heads. It's ritual head shaving they do as a community. And I think the very simple thing that any one of these folks could have done is have more community involvement from the start. It would have really avoided a lot of embarrassment and in some cases hardship. There is a lot of overlap between diplomacy and philanthropy. Sometimes great fundraisers become diplomats. Sometimes great diplomats go on to be great fundraisers at the end of their career. Hillary Clinton, great fundraiser, great diplomat. Lots of folks around D.C., right? And oftentimes that's how you get your ambassador appointment, right?
Exactly.
Why do you suppose that is? Are they similar skill sets?
Absolutely. Diplomacy and fundraising and diplomacy and running a nonprofit are, I would say, almost exactly the same skills. Basically, both people, whether you're a diplomat or a nonprofit professional, you're always trying to draw people and resources into whatever your initiative or current project is. You have a different focus maybe and a different mission. Obviously, the U.S. government, diplomat, you have a mission to support U.S. interests. Nonprofit, you support your community needs, but still at the end of the day, it's the same, drawing in people and resources, charisma and persuasive skills.
Fundamentally, I ask people for things and I thank people for things.
Same thing, yeah.
Every day I wake up and all day long, I ask people for things and I thank people for things, right? In that order. I don't... Yeah. Sometimes in order, before I ask you again, I thank you for the last thing that you did. Thank you again for coming on my pod. When I ask you, I'm going to ask you something eventually. Thank you again for coming on my podcast. That was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And then the next ask comes.
It'd be great if you could evaluate proposals with us this spring. That's certainly something I'm going to be asking you to do.
I know it's coming.
We've got a few months left. So when we talk about the work of being a nonprofit professional, you know what you're talking about. You, after your stint in diplomacy, and thank you for your service. We always thank soldiers for their service, but not necessarily nurses or diplomats or teachers, right?
But you don't always know a diplomat when you see one. A soldier, you see their uniform.
I think I saw it on your LinkedIn. And
yes.
Anyway, you could have not gone to Liberia, I suppose. Done something more comfortable with your time. Anyway, thank you for serving your country in that way. And I'm sure you were a good one. And I'm sure you were also a very good executive director, which you did for 22 years at 3 different organizations. And it's actually something that, so as the founder of a nonprofit, I guess executive director is one of the many jobs that I do over here, including podcast host. If I were in a position to hire away some of my job responsibilities, this is the first one I would not want. I would hire an executive director so I didn't have to do those things. I never wanted to be one. My whole career I was working at nonprofits in fundraising roles and other roles, right? Supporting the executive director. But you've decided to do it again and again and again. Why? What is it about it that you enjoy? You ask for things, thank them for things?
It's very much like being a diplomat, or again, a lot like doing theater, really. An executive director of a small to mid-sized nonprofit, for sure, is the ship's captain, as well as you're the chef and the bottle washer if no one else is around. So you do everything. I love the thrill and the excitement of, as you see from my background and my LinkedIn profile, 2 of my 3 executive director roles, I followed founders. And I love that. I love that with a passion, because I'm coming after someone who has had great passion, great energy, and my strength is coming in, looking around, creating structure, finding funders, and getting the organization to the next level. So I really get a great thrill out of that. My first executive director role was with Physician Assistant Foundation. And there at that time, this was in the early 2000s, physician assistants was a career choice in the United States, but it had not yet gone international. I had many physician assistants that were donors and members who wanted to do something international. So I was able to start a grant program. And then we began sending physicians assistants out to do great work in countries, a lot of the developing world, that really needed help. Also at Physician Assistant Foundation, there was not really a culture of individual giving. Mm-hmm. The physician assistant...
Who would give to the physicians other than physician assistants?
Would give. That was not a problem. Pharmaceuticals were good at giving. But
not the drugs themselves, people who worked in the pharmaceutical industry.
No, the pharmaceutical companies would give.
Corporate gifts from Merck and Pfizer.
Think about it. Good business sense there. But individuals, physician assistants, would have been one group of people that didn't necessarily have a culture of giving instilled with them.
The doctors are very... We talk to a lot of health organizations, and it is a challenge, and it is the number one recipient of funding is health.
Right.
particularly now in a pandemic, but it was true before the pandemic. But doctors themselves are they believe their work benefits mankind, and so they keep their money.
So there, I worked really hard. I started a 3-year giving campaign to draw physician assistants in to start them giving. And it took off. I mean, after they gave for 3 years, they started giving because of peer pressure, et cetera. Then they're sort of into the system, and they kind of, it becomes habit, which was good.
Well, I would imagine that the key there would have been to convince them. I'm imagining your grant proposal and starting to give you feedback. just what I do automatically, right? But I'm just thinking that, and obviously you don't work there anymore. But I would think that you'd want to convince them, show them how it could benefit their career, right? Like
exactly
the field
how it
of
would
being a
benefit their career.
assistant.
We also, quite honestly, did a lot of things which would be appropriate as far as donor recognition and peer engagement. If all of your peers are giving, you want to give too.
Yes. Very good. This is all very good advice for folks.
Then at Computer Corps, when I came in, there we were only serving 48 students a year in one site. So there the goal was to build out. Well, while I had some technology experience from my Fulbright days, I had to learn a lot about tech skills, servers, how to carry on a conversation with an engineer. All of that was something I, as an executive director, had to do in order to ultimately, we had 17 sites across the Northern Virginia area, all with its own servers and things. And there also, I did a big focus on earned income.
And even so, you're talking about the work you did in fundraising, but you succeeded there. But you also had to make sure you were you had your registration forms in, right?
Absolutely.
And that payroll was
you have to be legal and compliant,
right? And there's an awful lot of compliance. And in fact, as of 2018, there's an awful lot more compliance than most nonprofit. And as far as I can tell, full compliance is not technically possible. I believe the law says I'm supposed to be registered anywhere you can see my donate button, but not every state even offers the form I'm required to have.
7 states do not.
And that's the kind of thing that I would really, so I hope to hire an executive director that can be because we're giving advice to other nonprofits. So I really want to make sure our registrations are all correct, right? And that we're doing everything right ourselves. And I'd love someone who's as detail oriented as I to take some of that off my plate. You've mentioned that you took over for some founders, right?
Exactly.
I can already see how that's going to be difficult. I set this up myself. Unfunded List would not exist if it weren't for me. There would be no one reading these grant proposals. Right, so I do have some reason to think that I do know how to set it up.
Yeah, you've done very, very well. I mean, you're almost there, ready to hand it over because you do have structure.
For want of the.
Yeah, you've got the.
Ironically, we don't have a lot of grant success. We're working on it. We've been focused on the program and all that, and
right.
I have the time to be diligent and deliberate on it. But what advice when I'm in the position? Let's assume flash forward to the point where I'm in a position, right? Or Mackenzie Scott calls me up out of the blue, right? What are some tips for me for bringing in that first
most of them you've already
director?
mentioned. Again, document. Make sure that you have everything written down as much as possible. Make sure you have a strong board in place when you leave. I don't think I would ever leave. Is the thing. Yes.
Did these founders leave? And then you took over everything?
I strongly believe that the best thing that could happen is a founder to have trust and faith and step away at least for a few years, if not longer. I think that personally, having followed 2 founders, that organizations need to change to get to the next level, and that usually cannot happen with a founder. Now, that being said, I was at Computer Corps 11 years. It was very heartbreaking for me to leave after 11 years, but it was very important that I leave with a clean break. No, I can't come back and volunteer. No, I can't do grant writing, because the organization needed to go to that 3rd level. Founder, then me, then another. So yeah, I think it's important it's like letting your child leave to go to college or move out.
Mm-hmm. Certainly I would love, I imagine it's a common thing for founders to say. It does not sound realistic, given my knowledge of what my day to day is. Again, I'm doing 10 people's work. The executive director's one. So if I were to leave, who's going to do those other 9 jobs?
Well, that's where before you leave, you need to make sure there's that Mackenzie Scott has called.
So it's not. So I think the real tip you're saying for me is this isn't just about raising enough money to hire an executive director to take these things over. I need to raise enough money to bring in a whole team,
or to have a structure in place. The new person could come in and figure out what should the team look like.
Very good. There are many examples in the history of nonprofits of founder-led organizations where founders led them until they physically no longer could lead them.
Exactly.
I think for me, that's probably what's going to happen. I don't see what else I would do. I've focused my skill set on a very specific thing that wouldn't really I don't know how I would adapt it elsewhere. The other role that you mentioned when we were going back and forth about the interview is the role of an interim executive director. Many times, there's a lot of turnover in nonprofits. Executive directors get burned out. They get other job offers. They're underpaid. They get pretty easy to get lured away somewhere else. Sometimes people who work in the nonprofit sector realize that you can purchase things with money, and they go work in sales or become real estate agents. I've noticed a lot of them become, and that seems to be a similar skill set. If you're a good fundraiser for nonprofits, you're probably going to sell out. You're probably going to move houses. You were telling me that you want to be an interim executive director for the remainder of your career. It's an interesting choice. What's the difference between an interim executive director and an executive director?
Okay, so I'm a big believer in it. When I came to Computer Core and to Docs of Progress, I followed interims both cases, and I insisted at Computer Core they hire an interim after I left. An interim is someone who comes in and does an assessment and makes sure all is smooth and stable during the transition. It tends to be folks who have done a fair amount of work as an executive director before at different sorts of organizations. And at that point, it's folks who want to do sprints, not marathons. You come in and you work really hard for X number of time, and then you're on to look for your next interim job.
How long are we talking about?
Varies greatly. Best practice would be 6 to 10 months. Typically, some could be as short as 3. That's very unusual. Some could go nearly as long as 2 years. That's kind of unusual as well. But it varies greatly depending upon the organization's needs and also when they're ready to hire again.
It's pretty unusual for any nonprofit employee to stay in their job for longer than 2 years.
Exactly. So it's rare, but I can think of some interims who've ended up staying for almost 2 years, just the way things worked out for whatever reason. So
briefly before Unfunded List, I did some satirical work through the foundation, and one of our jokes is that I was the temporary indefinite executive director at the Moss Family Foundation. I mean, if you're the executive director, you have the same roles and responsibilities and everything, right? Why is it important to clarify that you're just there in the interim? In fact, many executive directors are only going to be there for as long as you've mentioned anyway, in reality.
Exactly.
So,
I mean, one of your roles is to assess the organization and help the board and the staff and the donors and other constituents look at and understand if any change is needed, and also to create a stable and smooth environment, because transition and change is scary. So getting a new executive can be very, very, very stressful, certainly on boards and on staff.
Yes. In my experience as a nonprofit employee, a new executive director means that I'll be working somewhere else soon.
Exactly. So the interim's role is to keep things as stable as possible.
I'm generally not the kind of person who stays around after someone new comes in at the top. They want to change things up, and it usually doesn't. Usually not. It's just that my personal experience. But it is, as I've noted a couple times, there's a huge retention problem nonprofits.
Right. And of course, there's a great retention problem everywhere now with the great resignation. So,
well, I find that very interesting. The nonprofit sector has not seen that in as great numbers as some other fields. I do think lack of meaning is a big part of why a lot of people are leaving their jobs, and not part of why it is not a concern. Most people, it's why they stay in a job that is underpaid, doesn't have enough benefits and stuff, because the meaning is great. It's Atlas Corps, for instance, the benefits package and salary were not in any way part of why I was working there. I often forgot. I was like when the paychecks were coming, I was like, oh yes, I get paid, sort of. Still a lot more than the stipend the fellows receive, but the not any well less than half of the average salary for people working on the block. I was on K Street in Washington D.C. Yeah. Right. What do you think about that? Like, how can we run a nonprofit if everybody's leaving their jobs every 18 months? It's not a problem for me. I don't have anybody, but
it's not all of the positions. It's certainly within the fundraising realm, and it's been that way for a long time, because that's one of those jobs. You know, there's been things written about it by various foundations. Even the whole structure of setting up a nonprofit and having a development department and having development directors. Can they really do what they need to do in the amount of time they're given? Do they have the resources to do it? Is too much expected? You know, that's been debated there. Overall, you hit the nail on the head. The thing that will keep people with nonprofits tends to be the working environment and the culture. Can you set up the culture so people want to come to work, people enjoy it, and nonprofits have the capacity typically to have sort of unique benefits or different benefits. At Atlas Corps, you probably got to meet a lot of fabulous young people and international people.
Yes.
They may be able to do something like give more time off. They may be able to
no, in fact, no. The main way they were able to pay me is that I got to meet those fellows. In fact, I still know those fellows. So the money, I spent it long ago, or simply misplaced it. It was that little. It's in the couch somewhere. But those fellows all still exist. They all got to have great experiences. A lot of them connect me because I was a very visible part of their. A lot of them think I'm like the whole reason why they got the thing, because I'm the only one they were like talking, you know. But really, there were a lot of other folks filling out visa paperwork and doing other things of that sort that helped me along the way. But again, that was the main reason that I was doing it there. It ultimately was not enough to keep me there. I never really wanted to like found my own nonprofit. I used to say the same thing that you were just saying. Like there were too many founded. I did find ours before there was a recent spike in new ones being founded, and I was a little bit predated that. Yeah. So as usual, I'm a trend starter. No one in DC had beards when I first moved here. It's just what I'll say. It's just what I'll say. Everybody was wearing ties too. But that one was Obama. Obama one day forgot to put his tie on, and then it was okay to not wear. Then it was okay to not wear a tie anymore. Because Bush, when I moved to DC, Bush was president, and he wore a tie every single day of his presidency, and I'm sure he's wherever he is now on his ranch, probably wearing a tie. Painting, I guess, is what he does. All right, I have a few more questions I want to ask you. This has been very informative. We may have to consider having you back, or have you do a panel with us or something. We are increasingly doing the kinds of panels that are very similar to those certificate for nonprofit management thing that you've set up. And I think maybe offline we can talk about that. We have, in fact, a unfunded fellow working with us this round. There are a lot of folks interested in getting education in the process of reading grant proposals. And we have some needs of our program. Yeah. And again, one of the reasons why I don't think I could hire someone to replace me is it would be illegal for me to write down everything I write in a job description and ask somebody to do that. And that is what we have to do in order to run the program. So like, who's going to read 175 grant proposals in 2 days and then thoughtfully assign them to 800 different I can't, right? When I have to do that, it is very helpful to have evaluators like yourself who can read pretty much anything. You've done stuff in the arts. You've done stuff with video. You've done stuff with health. You have international experience, right? I think the question I wrote here is, how do you balance your many passions? I don't know. Did you that doesn't sound like me.
It's your question. I did not.
I think I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it slightly. It was a one. Thank you for being. Usually, it's just like these people want to read global gender equality proposals.
Okay.
Right. These people want to read arts. Right. And I'm thinking that way. It's great when folks can read from all different kinds. Right. But a lot of people are more issue focused than you are. What's it like to have so many different interests? There's a lot going on in all these fields.
Well, first of all, I mean, my skill really is nonprofit management. I mean, that is it. Not necessarily healthcare.
So you could go work on any issue. We could introduce a new issue into the mix.
I know the legal things and the things that need to be done. And then I would argue that translates over into my interests, which my primary interest, which you identified spot on in your questions, global gender equality and the arts. So while my professional focus is nonprofit management, the two things that I engage in almost all my free time when I'm not reading proposals for you, Dave, at Unfunded List, is I'm board chair for an organization called Together Women Rise. We're a giving circle that has more than 400 chapters across the country, and we have a traditional grants program where we give away $35,000 to $50,000 each month to a grantee that's helping advance equality for women and girls in developing countries. Again, my passion there. We also are just launching a transformational partnership grants program, which is in line with some of the trends in philanthropy. And then the other thing I love that I spend my time with is live theater. I'm involved on the governance committee for Theater Washington, and then I do some things with Cinetic and Washington Stage Guild.
Oh, cool.
And I do a huge amount of producing with the Little Theater of Alexandria. So, and again, it gets back to really philanthropy. Two of my favorite shows I produced were, and I don't know if you'll know them, you probably will because you're a theater person, Intimate Apparel by Lynn Nottage, and then The Revolutionist by Lauren Gunderson. You know, again, they have great messages, and it's a way to tell people about issues and concerns in the world and maybe get them engaged.
Yes. I have a degree in theater arts. And one of the things that I wish they had taught me while I was paying them money to get this degree is that theater is like not a real business. You can't really there's anyone making money in theater is an extreme outlier. The vast majority of theater is done by people who are not getting paid or compensated in any way and doing it for the love of it.
I did a financial analysis of professional theaters in DCO about 6 or 7 years ago. I took the list from Theater Washington and all of the professional theaters, and I went through and looked at their 990s. And this was, again, from the big ones like Arena Theater, Arena Stage, and a huge number of small professional theaters that not everyone's heard of. Most of us have not. The average annual income was $194,000. For each theater. When you did it as an average, again, Arena Stage,
including some very large, some very large places.
Those are all the really big ones. But when you added in the small ones,
I'm sure some of them have their budgets. I mean, I was involved in the run of a show in town about Jean Calvin. We got a small grant from the Union of Presbyterian Churches, and I played a Presbyterian, and I played a Catholic character. It would have been because this was dirt. They hadn't quite protested yet.
Okay.
Right. I played John Calvin's law school roommate, Francois Daniel. And in general, he was Calvin would complain to me about the church, and I didn't care. That was my role, was to show that the average French person didn't really wasn't following it as closely. Which it was a fun thing for me because in my actual life, I was usually the opposite, following everything much more closely than the average person. It was a fun part to play. And we did a long run of that because it was Calvin's 500th birthday. And so the Presbyterians really wanted everyone, Calvin's very important to them. They wanted this show to go to every single church, and we got to do a long run. And yeah, we got paid on occasion or whatever, but literally everyone involved in it had a full-time job somewhere else, right? Real estate agent, working at a nonprofit, doing something else like that, right? And the theater sustains through the passion of the practitioners. It exists in almost every community in the world, and not because it's inside the wheel of capitalism and meeting its bottom lines. It long ago freed itself when, I forget whoever it was, the Thespis first stepped out of the chorus, right? So we have a long tradition of freeing ourselves. Thank you for all your work in theater. It is something that, right, the arts, music as well, lots of musicians not getting paid properly, even though literally everybody consumes music.
Yeah.
Right? But when it comes to paying artists for it, it's like, well, I don't know about that. Yes, I'm going to listen to music every single day. And I'll pay record companies and I'm happy to pay them, right? But not necessarily them. One of my favorite groups that we review regularly is the Navok Foundation, which supports women artists around the globe. Given your interest in global gender equity, I imagine I've asked you to read that before.
I think you have.
While I've got you here, do I in general do a good job evaluating proposals to you?
Well, that's what I like. I mean, you're very receptive. Like I've told you before, like when I first started, I didn't like some of the ones. So then you gave me others.
I get that feedback a lot. You told me that so you said you didn't like, I was giving you an outside your area and you gave me some feedback and I adjusted properly?
Yeah, you adjusted it. And
that's
I
the
also
goal.
like the fact that your timing's really good. You give a lot of heads up before the cycle starts. And it's a much longer reading period than I have with some other places I review.
Yes, we go back and forth. We give a long period, which is interesting.
And that can be good and bad because I know you have some reviewers, everybody waits till the last night.
There's a dark period in the middle.
Yeah.
A lot of them do it right away in the beginning, first couple weeks.
Right.
And then there's 2 weeks where no one does anything.
And
then
at
the second week, a lot of people come in. And no matter what we do, the very last day, in fact, usually we get more feedback after the deadline than before because so many people are waiting until the very end. I do talk about Christmas morning evaluators, right? I'm not Christmas is very universal, even though I myself am Jewish. I do know everything about Christmas. And the kids, when they see the presents under the tree, they just open them right away. They don't say, when is the deadline for opening these gifts? Right? And a lot of our evaluators enjoy reading these proposals so much that they get right to it the moment I assign it to them, which is a really neat. I didn't really expect that to be part of this program. And most folks, they're like giving grants that have volunteer reviewers. They're going to wait till the last minute, and it usually is pretty burdensome. When I've had to do that, they don't necessarily give me. I've been frustrated a few times where there were proposals in the batch that were like a perfect fit for me and my interests, but I got assigned other ones because that's what needed to be read. Right? And because they know I can read pretty much anything, right? I tend to get the stuff that can't possibly be assigned to anybody else. And I imagine that may have happened to you on some other committees and stuff.
It has, yeah. Sometimes I've had some real doozies.
Speaking of some doozies, I'm going to end with some big questions. Right, well, I'm going to combine two of these here because we've been talking for a good long while. And I'm sure the folks are fascinated and listening, but they probably have to make dinner, or their drive home has probably ended by now and they're just sitting in the driveway waiting for the podcast to end, right? Or they long ago missed their stop. Right? So what's in organized philanthropy, what's the most important thing happening?
I think it's two things right now. One is the obvious. COVID-19 has thrown everything up in the air, everything. I mean, it's made folks realize maybe we ought to be doing more now and not waiting to give our money away.
It made many foundations realize that they should stop funding Unfunded List. There's been a great deal of change in what is being funded. Exactly. So it's a big issue. And that wasn't COVID so much. That was more several of our funders pivoted towards diversity and inclusion.
Exactly. That's another big one, too, that's getting a lot of attention now. So that is interesting to watch that. On the positive side, and I mentioned it with Together Women Rise, this concept of transformational grants, partnerships, working more closely with grantees. So, Dave, this takes us back to our conversations about Africa and the merry-go-round pumps and the camels in Tanzania. Talk to your grantees first. Don't form a structured grant program that they have to somehow stuff their organization and program into, but let them express their needs, be flexible, and work with them together so you can achieve what the community needs. And I think that's getting more traction than I've seen it get in my many years in the field. We have had false starts before that have failed, I will admit.
It's a new field overall. It's arguably under 100 years old, organized philanthropy.
So I'm very excited by this, and I'm hoping it continues to evolve so that we do more good for those who need it.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you for evaluating all the proposals with us, and thank you for coming on a very lengthy podcast and talking about philanthropy with me for a long time.
Thank you, Dave. It was a great experience.
And best of luck with all your grant making. And I will be assigning you some proposals in just a couple months.
I had no doubt. I look forward to it.
All right. Thank you very much.